Everybody, please welcome to the stage, Ben Tumin!
Amazing. Hello, everybody. Hello. Hi. Nice to see you all. Thank you so much for being here. This is very exciting. I forgot to set this up beforehand. This is one of my favorite subjects, if not my favorite subject. I also just want to say I recently remembered that it's the 5-year anniversary of Skipped History in 2 days. So thank you all. Thank you all for supporting and enabling this experience. And if you're unfamiliar with Skipped History, welcome. You'll see why it may or may not be a good idea soon. I should also say, just as one point of introduction, in that time, I've interviewed 150 historians, maybe, and read hundreds of history books. But there is one history book that stands out above them all, or at least stands out in my mind most of the time. And today, we will be talking about it and the person at the center of it, Robert Moses. The man. Yes. Okay, get your hisses out. Get your hisses out. You can hiss at any point. This is a hissing safe space. But Moses, more than anyone else, shaped modern-day New York. He built our highways, our bridges, our beaches, our playgrounds, our parks, our pools, our cultural centers, our housing projects, one Venetian-style bell tower, which we will return to. There is a sing-along portion of the show. And so much more. New York, as we know it today, would be very different without Moses. He was never elected, and yet over a 40-year period, beginning after World War I, he constructed public works costing roughly $250 billion in today's dollars. Inarguably, and often horridly, he is one of the most accomplished builders in U.S. history. He's one of the most accomplished builders in world history, and it's hard to overstate his continued impact on our lives. And just like that, we've summed up the entire Power Broker. We can stop right now. I won't take a poll of the audience, especially because this is the first of a trilogy of shows bringing the Power Broker to life. Along the way, Robert Caro, the author of The Power Broker, extraordinary biographer, his feelings about Moses, who I think is here, yes. His feelings about Moses, as well as my own, will become clear. I grew up in Manhattan, surrounded by Moses' structures. And Moses' structures, by the way, are surrounding us now. He's constructed many of the parks in this neighborhood. He constructed many of the housing complexes nearby. But on balance, of all the things that he did, let's just say there's a reason that the only statue you'll find of him in or close to New York City is in Babylon, Long Island, facing a gas station and an internal medicine clinic. By the way, if you're having foot pain, they offer excellent podiatry. I can vouch for it. If you're suffering from other kinds of movements, might I recommend their Department of Transportation? And speaking of transportation, the city that Moses left behind wasn't necessarily better off. Sure, we had new roads, we had new housing, but to fund them, Moses drained funding from public transportation, with consequences all of you have experienced at one point or another. And to build all of those things, he evicted hundreds of thousands of people from their homes. Along the way, through it all, he claimed he was above corruption, even though, as we'll see, he was dirtier than the benches near his statue in Babylon, which, as local guide John Gardner IV will helpfully tell you, could use some upkeep. It's a very strange experience visiting that statue, by the way. There is no one else looking at it. The same could be said of New York at the end of Moses' reign. It could use some upkeep. The city was starved for decent housing, landlords held enormous power, and the city was filled with congestion. Moses didn't create all of those problems, but he made all of them a lot worse. And our mayoral candidates today, every leader, every official you've encountered in New York City, in person or virtually, has had to deal with the ramifications. If we want to get to the bottom of why New York City can be so hard to live in, we have to get to the bottom of Robert Moses. I will also add that as I've reflected on the anniversary of Skipped History coming up, which again I just remembered, I've been thinking about all of the interviews that I've done and all of the history that I've explored, and there's been lots of it, and I'm starting to think, this is just a general hypothesis that I'm happy to share with all of you and the people on the live stream. Just kidding, there's no live stream. I'm starting to think that one of the US's great chances for change occurred in the 1960s under LBJ, and that another great chance for change occurred 100 years earlier during Reconstruction, and that if we want to open another window for change now, we will need to transform our physical surroundings and sever a bridge from a really bigoted and horrid past to our present. And exploring Robert Moses, I think, is a really, really good and horrible and fun way of understanding that history and where we can go from here. So, today we'll begin by exploring Moses' upbringing and his studies before talking about the problem of space that New York faced. We'll then have a brief intermission when you can get another drink, before then investigating how Moses accrued and used power on Long Island, and then through a combination of trickery and brilliance, tilted democracy off course. As Robert Caro might tell you, Moses contained multitudes.
Yeah, he was a wonderful poet when he was at Yale, you know. Really? He would say, if the end doesn't justify the means, what does? Well, you say, oh, well, that's right. But then you say,
wait a minute.
Wait a minute. What are the means?
Yeah, exactly.
So Moses was a poet who believed the ends justify the means. He inherited many of those qualities, especially the sharper-edged ones, from two very strong-willed women who shaped him, his mother and his grandmother. So our story today, like The Power Broker, begins, or I should say part one of The Power Broker. We'll get to the introduction shortly. Our story today, like part one of The Power Broker, will begin in Bavaria, specifically the small village of Reckendorf, where Robert Moses' grandmother, Rosalie, was born. I couldn't find any photos of Rosalie, but I also descend from Bavarian Jews on my mother's side. So for the sake of visualization, here's a photo of my great aunt Edna. I'll add Robert Moses' eyebrows to her. And for the record, those are actually Robert Moses' eyebrows. I photoshopped them onto my great aunt and got to know her in a new way. And I'll add some accessory to make her look less like George Washington. And voila, you have Rosalie Silverman, born in Reckendorf in 1826. Back then, Reckendorf was known for its fierce anti-Semitism. Laws segregated German Jewish families from non-Jewish ones and prevented Jews from leaving the ghetto without paying a Jew toll. Statutes also prevented Jews from owning any land except the land on which their houses stood, and from dealing in any goods that they couldn't transport with them. Fast forward to today, and the Reckendorf town square still has some alarming eagle imagery. As I saw on a recent family trip, and aside from a family trip, I don't know what that eagle is. It was just eerie being there. But even eerier was the sign nearby, warning people not to give the local catfish a cigarette. As you'll see, I learned what that sign said the hard way. Given how unwelcoming Reckendorf was, the Silvermans, like many Jews, decided to get out. When Rosalie was in her teens, the family came here to New York. Soon she met her husband, or would-be husband, Bernard, who was also from Reckendorf and also her first cousin. Don't knock it before you try it. I do not condone that, just to be clear. But feel free to try anything. I'm not here to judge your life. I'm here to judge Robert Moses' life. And Bernard, Rosalie's husband, started a successful real estate business and became a millionaire. Yet Rosalie's status as the head of the household was never in question. As one family member later recalled, the way Granny Cohen treated Grandfather Cohen was quite striking. She absolutely sat on him. Unless you think that reputation was only earned at home, when buying tickets for a railroad trip or a play, her practice was to eye the queue of ticket buyers disdainfully and then stride up to the first man on it and simply elbow him out of the way. If you're wondering, this strategy is not for the faint of heart today.
Damn it.
Rosalie and Bernard had 5 kids. None of these people are their kids. That's still my family. But given that Robert Moses' mother, Bella, had a quiet, unassuming manner, let's say she's the person pictured here. I'll add Robert Moses' eyebrows to her, and voila, you have Bella Cohen. Still, despite her unassuming manner, don't get it twisted. Of all of Rosalie and Bernard's kids, Bella was the most like her mother. As one family member later said, it didn't take you long, or an acquaintance said, it didn't take you long to realize that under that quiet manner was an astonishing amount of arrogance. She was her mother's daughter. And in more ways than one. Like Rosalie, Bella was the undisputed head of her household. In 1886, when she was 26, she married Emmanuel Moses, a 35-year-old department store owner from New Haven. There, they settled down at 86 Dwight Street. Here photographed with Robert Moses standing in front many years later. I can get out of the way for you. Okay. Robert, the middle child, was born in 1887. His older brother, Paul Emmanuel Moses, was born the year before. Their younger sister, Edna Marion Moses, was born in 1891. Robert, the middle child, was the only one who didn't get a middle name, making him deeply relatable to neglected middle children everywhere. The last time I did this, a lot of people clapped for that. So it's more like, I'm just wondering how many middle children were in the audience last time. My mother included. But otherwise, besides the frustration with the middle name, Robert and the rest of the family's childhood in New Haven was idyllic. The houses on Dwight Street had big backyards with grape arbors and stables. Kids rode up and down the streets on horses and played in each other's backyards. Later on, Moses would say that their childhood there was comfortable, and Paul would say it was shady, well-kept, nice. But to Bella, it was hell. In her mind, there just wasn't enough culture in New Haven, and in 1896, she insisted the family move to New York. Robert was not happy about the move. He'd later say, I didn't like New York at all. It was too big. The crowds, the noise, and the confusion were terrible. I wanted to go back to New Haven. In other words, the man who would later shape modern-day New York preferred, at least in his earlier years, to live in Connecticut. The C word. Moses would get his wish, returning to a small, humble local university in New Haven for college, Yale. I have so much disdain for the history of these universities, and also for lots of the present of these universities. At the time, Yale bragged about being a progressive institution, but you could count on several hands the number of people the school discriminated against, and on a few fingers the kinds of people the school embraced. White Christian men. Of the 351 exclusively white male members of Moses' freshman class, there were 5 Jews, listed as Hebrews in the freshman blue book, and lumped together with the class's 18 Roman Catholics under miscellaneous denominations. A little like the time my ice cream store offered 2 flavors, vanilla bean speck vanilla bean speck, vanilla bean speck, vanilla bean speck, vanilla bean speck, and space cake. I got the vanilla bean speck. As you might expect, Moses was a loner at Yale, to start off at least, but he still found rewarding ways to use his time. Remember what Robert Caro said.
Yeah, he was a wonderful poet when he was at Yale, you know. Really?
Really. Living on his own as a freshman and sophomore, Moses would stay up late reading and writing poetry about beauty and truth. He was particularly enamored of the Mona Lisa. After seeing this makes me laugh so much. After seeing it one summer, Moses wrote a poem about his favorite painting in the style of Algernon Charles Swinburne's Dolores. If you're unfamiliar with Dolores, it's 440 lines long, and the narrator has a thing for Dolores. Unfortunately, Moses didn't write 400 lines about the Mona Lisa, but he did compose the following, read to you by my friend and storyteller, Chris Dooley.
Age has etched out thine eyelids aweary, and thy fleeting intangible smile, the eyes that are somber and dreary, thou Artemis, Circe of guile. Are we ever constrained to surrender, forever to bow at thy shrine? Most subtle, most cruel, most tender, Our Lady divine.
Beautiful. Clearly, Moses also had a thing for Mona. I will say, on a more somber note, that there is something, for me and also I think for Caro in The Power Broker, about Moses's passion for the Mona Lisa and for poetry, a sort of unspoken question of what else could he have done with his life? After all, when most people see the Mona Lisa, they don't compose a poem about the painting. They go on Reddit and write, "I was surprised how small the Mona Lisa is." But Moses' passion for art and his eye for detail, as we'll see, were inseparable from his accomplishments, good and bad, later on. At Yale, Moses also joined the swim team. Here we actually have a photo of Robert Moses at Yale. He joined the swim team, and it was in that capacity that a rather revealing incident occurred. Caro opens The Power Broker, the introduction to the book, by describing an episode detailing the Minor Sports Association. Long story short, and it is a rather somewhat long story, Moses organized this association, and it consisted of the wrestling, hockey, fencing, swimming, and basketball teams. The idea was that they could conduct a general fundraising campaign and split the money among the various teams, which were relatively underfunded. And Moses' efforts really exemplified his idealism. Caro stresses this in the book. But his plan encountered a snag. The swim team was funded largely by one person, Ogden Mills Reed, the team's first great swimmer, and the answer to the trivia question, where did the last woolly mammoth go? Ed Richards, the swim team captain, who is pictured here, that's not Ed Richards, by the way. But we need, at this point in time, we have to use a lot of visualizations. Ed Richards, the swim team captain pictured here, worried that Ogden Mills Reed wouldn't want to contribute to a minor sports association, and that might leave the swim team with less money than it had before. When he expressed his doubts to Moses, Moses replied, "Oh, that's all right. I just won't tell him it's going to an association. He'll think it's the regular contribution to the swimming team." Cheeky, cheeky. Here's the rest of the passage, read to you again by Chris Dooley.
Now, Richard said slowly, I think that's a little bit tricky, Bob. I think that's a little bit smooth. I don't like that at all. Well, you've got nothing to say about it, he said. Yes, I do, Richard said. I'm the captain. I'm responsible, and I'm telling you not to do it. Well, I'm going to do it anyway, Moses said. If you do, Richard said, I'll go to Og and tell him that the money isn't going where he thinks it is. If you don't let me do it, he said, I'm going to resign from the team. Well, Bob, Richard said, your resignation is accepted. Bob Moses turned and walked out of the pool. He never swam for Yale again.
I do all my own animations. So this was a dramatic moment, and for the record, I want to stress that Moses did try to get back on the swim team, but Ed Richards wouldn't allow it. We'll circle back to that later on. Moses didn't yet have the power to pull off that kind of move. But Caro opens the book by detailing this episode because it's revealing from an early age of Moses' arrogance, his idealism, and a sort of guiding dogma that we'll come back to time and time again.
He would say, if the end doesn't justify the means, what does? Well, you say, oh, well, that's right. But then you say,
Wait a minute.
wait a minute. What are the means?
Yeah,
you know?
exactly.
To Moses, any means, he would destroy people who stood in his way.
Despite getting kicked off the swim team, despite being Jewish in an environment very unfriendly to Jews, Moses managed to outshine most of his classmates. During his senior year, when there were elections for a 7-member senior council, the winners were 6 members of fraternities that barred Jews from joining, and Moses. Clearly, he was widely respected. Significantly, though, despite coming to Yale as an outsider and an underdog, Moses showed little interest in challenging the school's stiff social hierarchy. Rather, he chose to clamber up the hierarchy. And once you're at the top, it can be hard not to look down, especially if you then pursue graduate studies at Oxford. Oxford, at the time, was the castle keep of British conservatism. In Caro's words, its tone in 1909 had been set for the preceding 3 centuries by rich young men sent there to prepare or as a preliminary to public life. Public life, of course, meant governing Britain's various territories overseas and Britain. Put another way, if ever in the history of the world there were a time and place to pursue a degree in how to rule the world and feel like you deserve to, it was either Oxford in 1909, the Academy of Genghis Khan in 1150, or MIT Rex 150 million years ago. I also do my own Photoshops. It didn't take long for Moses to adopt Oxford's superiority complex. At the time, there were growing calls from Britain's colonies for self-government. Turns out, hundreds of years of racial hierarchy and insisting it really is called aluminium tend to frustrate people. Nevertheless, at a World Conference on Race Problems in 1911, Moses insisted that equality was not practical, and that the subject peoples of the British Empire were simply not ready for self-government yet. Furthermore, he didn't see a time in the future when they would be. What explains Moses' condescension? He was racist. Let's get this out of the way now. Moses was a deeply, deeply bigoted man. Most of the people who he evicted from his homes, or a significant portion of them, were Black and Puerto Rican residents of New York City. And Moses did not show very much remorse for that. We'll get to that in part 2. But also, while at Oxford, Moses seems to have fused with the elitism of the British with the arrogance and the condescension of Rosalie and Bella. In his thesis, his senior thesis, we see that really on display. He wrote about the civil service of Great Britain, basically how the British ran government. And Moses wrote glowingly of how Britain had a very small administrative and policy-making upper division reserved for university men, and a much larger lower division consisting of clerks of ordinary education meant to do the lower and more mechanical work. Now, I, for one, don't find mechanical work low. In fact, if you're able to install an air conditioner or bookshelves or anything that requires a drill, I will grovel at your feet. Otherwise, the outcome is this. This is what happens when I try to install curtain rods and someone else has to finish the job. But in Moses' mind, if you need help with any handy tasks, don't call me. In Moses' mind, Britain's clear distinction, however, between a ruling elite and everyone else wasn't just a good idea. It was a brilliant one, far-sighted even, because it meant the most intelligent and capable young men in universities would be the ones in charge. Basically, He looked at Britain's system of government and deduced that government in America should be ruled by men whose birth and breeding had allowed them to attend one of 3 colleges: Princeton, Harvard, or of course, Yale, which is such a nightmarish vision of the world. These are people who like to live in Connecticut. Moses' views were captured by a speaker hosted by Oxford's American Club, who declared that we should carry into the bustle and stir of the new world the atmosphere of the old. And Bella, it seems, gave Moses some ideas for how to introduce old world charm to the new world. You see, Bella had a most unusual interest in physical construction. She demonstrated her interest through the settlement house movement. Settlement houses at the time offered food, housing, and medical care to newly arrived immigrants. The Madison House, or Hamilton Madison House, full name, where Bella volunteered, was one of these places in the settlement house movement, and Bella was one of many wealthy German Jewish women who volunteered there. But unlike just about everybody else, when the discussions turned to the laying out of basketball courts, or the creation of a summer camp in the country for slum children, Bella would begin to inundate the other trustees with a flood of ideas. And her ideas typically won out. As one staffer said, in a quiet way, Mrs. Moses could really be quite impatient. She knew what she wanted and she intended to have it. Said another staffer, she liked to get things done, and if she had to step on toes to get them done, she'd step on toes. If you're wondering, this strategy is not for the faint of heart today.
Oh, come on, damn it. What are you doing?
I just want to say that the person who is in those videos is actually in the audience tonight. We worked through our differences. And she got a Metro card. So Bella had this unusual interest in public construction, or physical construction, and New York at the time was badly in need of more physical construction. As more and more immigrants arrived to the city, it got very crowded. In the 1910s, the city's population grew by over 1 million people to 5 million. In the 1920s, the rate of increase was only accelerating. Consequently, people were pouring into the city, and they were also pouring out of the city in their free time for a few reasons. First, they actually had free time. The length of the factory work week went down drastically in the 1920s, thanks in no small part to Henry Ford, America's favorite anti-Semite. The history of Henry Ford is quite sordid, as you might be familiar. We can talk about that after the show. Also, more people had cars. Prior to World War I, around 1917, if I'm getting the dates of World War I right, my former history teachers in the audience, please don't listen. Prior to World War I, there were around 7 million car-owning families in the US. After the war, by 1923, there were 23 million people, or 23 million families that owned cars. And like I said, it was really crowded. So people had free time, they had their cars, and they wanted to use them to get out of the city. There was one problem. There was nowhere to go. To the north, in Westchester, locals had barred non-residents from entering any of their parks. Westchester? Sorry, I'm really revealing my feelings about the tri-state area here. To the west, in New Jersey, we won't go there. To the west, in New Jersey, there is Interstate Palisades Park. But since there were still no bridges or tunnels that connected New York to New Jersey, or Manhattan to New Jersey, you had to book passage on one of the few small ferries that traveled across the Hudson. To the south, southwest, you needed scuba certification. And this amazing instructor on 23rd Street wasn't alive yet, so why bother? I meant to invite them to the show. I'll try and get them next time. And then that left the east, AKA Long Island. And Long Island, okay, I'm here for Long Island. Long Island had all sorts of advantages. The East River, unlike the other arrow here, yes, there's Long Island. The East River, unlike the Hudson River, had 4 bridges, and leading out from those bridges were boulevards that ran out to Long Island. Also, Long Island had space. It covered an area 4 times the size of New York City, but had a population less than 1/25th as large. If you want a visual of space at the time, picture it like jeans. Here is New York, a millennial, and here is Long Island, a member of Gen Z. That might be, my fashion understanding might be inaccurate here, so forgive me, but that's how it seems to me. Long Island also had something else going for it. Actually, I should say, Long Island also had a problem. No one on Long Island wanted anyone from New York City in their space. So the same problem that occurred in Westchester occurred in Long Island, and in fact, it was magnified. Take the Great South Bay, for example, home to gentle waves, sandy beaches, and legendarily cranky baymen who had also erected parks and then prevented anybody from New York City from entering them. Then there was the North Shore, aka the Gold Coast. Basically, every robber baron you've ever heard of owned property or had a business partner who owned property on the Gold Coast. Their estates were enormous. Some were hundreds of acres in size, some were thousands of acres in size, and they were surrounded by giant walls and patrolled by private police forces. For context, this is what one of those estates looks like today. It was the setting for The Great Gatsby, which is set in the 1920s. And in my own one and only literary reference that doesn't come from a history book, you can see the blinking green light in the distance. So the North Shore was also inaccessible. One of the only places New Yorkers could visit out on Long Island was Smithtown, where, and this is not a joke, people would go to cemeteries and use fallen tombstones as makeshift picnic tables. If that sounds creepy, I visited one of these cemeteries, and departed souls do open up when you share your macaroni salad. It was very hot and things got weird. So now you begin to get a sense of the problem here and also the opportunity. Given how much space there was on Long Island, and let me just asterisk this right now, we're talking about conceptions of space from the viewpoint of reformers at the time, from New Yorkers. I've interviewed, not to keep going back to my interviews, but I've interviewed many indigenous authors, for example, who would say that that conception of space as being empty is not so accurate. It's actually quite full and was full for millennia with various people and also many ecosystems. So let's just put an asterisk in our conceptions of space for a moment. But going back to 1920s conceptions of space and before, you begin to get a sense of why reformers had dreamt for years of turning lots of that space into parks and beaches for New Yorkers desperate for an escape. But it was really hard. How could they acquire space from hostile millionaires and hostile local governments? Even if they could acquire space, how could they acquire enough of it to serve millions of people? And if somehow they could then turn that space into parks and beaches, how would anybody be able to get there? They would need new roads whose rights of way would cross lots of people's land. For years, no one had the answers to those questions. But then Robert Moses, recently returned from Oxford, began to think about them. His first job after university was working for the Bureau of Municipal Research. This is actually them, that's not a family photo. Moses, building on what was already an exceptional knowledge of public administration, both in the US and Britain, set to work studying city and state law and grew into one of the foremost experts, if not the foremost expert on New York state law. He also wasted no time letting his colleagues know that he thought he was smarter than them and that his ideas were the best. And to be fair, he might have had a point. One of his friends wondered quite seriously whether Bob Moses was not the best educated in public administration in the whole country. A flex almost as cool as David Record Breaker Rush holding the Guinness World Record for longest time spent balancing an unpowered lawnmower on the chin.
This last 17 minutes, I was in the zone. I was focused. I was going. I felt good. Though it was like I was about to die at any given moment.
27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33.
Yes, give it up for David Record Breaker Rush. Yes, American hero, American hero. Love him. Unlike David Record Breaker Rush, who holds the Guinness World Record for most Guinness World Records held at one time, it's over 180. Pretty cool. You might see more of them. Unlike David Record Breaker Rush, Moses rubbed everyone the wrong way and lost his job. There we go. He also got married and had a kid and was in need of work. Serendipitously, Al Smith, New York's new governor, could use someone with Moses' skill set. Smith wanted to clean up New York state government, which was just woefully inefficient. There were 169 overlapping departments, which had many of the same functions. In one instance, 7 different agencies collected taxes, which made tax day extra, 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 extra special. Pay your taxes. Okay, we'll keep working on the riff there. So Smith could use someone with Moses' skill set, and Moses, in need of work, was glad to join his staff. In 1923, using his exceptional knowledge of state law, Moses set to work consolidating the state government from 169 departments into just 24. That streamlining, in turn, helped Al Smith do things like secure workers' compensation and push through shorter working hours and better conditions for women. If those reforms sound familiar, that is because FDR, who would succeed Al Smith as governor of New York, modeled many New Deal reforms on Al Smith's reforms. An accomplishment that helps you understand why Robert Caro spends a lot of time talking about Al Smith in The Power Broker. Not complaining, just warning you if you haven't read it, there's a lot of Al Smith. Get ready, he's a very fascinating character. The only person, if Caro were to live to, well, he's 89 now, so if he were to live to, and finishing his last LBJ book, so if he were to live to, I don't know, 125, which hopefully he does, he said the last person he read a biography about would be Al Smith. So Al Smith is a formidable character. He inspired FDR, and he got all these things done in New York because of Robert Moses. Over and over, he asked Moses in 1923 and 1924, what can I do for you in return? What can I do for all of the work that you've done for me? Moses kept deflecting, but as it turns out, an idea was brewing. Parks. Come out after the intermission, and we'll talk more about that. So kind. We just saw each other. Welcome back to the second half. Let's talk a little bit about Robert Caro, thirst trap. Just to give some background on Caro's writing of The Power Broker, it took him 7 years. During that time, he conducted hundreds of interviews and did lots of, or I guess it would be countless hours of archival research. He did manage to interview Robert Moses on 7 different occasions. Moses was at first very resistant to being interviewed, but when he realized that the person who would turn into America's foremost biographer wasn't going to let it go, he finally relented, and then he warmed to the task. During those 7 interviews, some of them lasted for a few hours, some of them lasted entire days. On the 7th and final occasion, Caro asked Moses about some bribery. Another reporter, Caro was a reporter before becoming a biographer, another reporter had tipped Caro off to carbon copies of records that Moses had forgotten to burn. And those records contain details of illicit payments. When Caro asked Moses about those payments, Moses soon ended the interview, and they never saw each other again. We will get to the bribery. We'll get to that side of Moses. But I want to start with a different side of Moses that came to the fore in 1923 and 1924 as he was thinking about what he wanted in exchange for the work he had done for Al Smith. Here is Robert Caro.
Moses takes a summer house. He rents a summer house because he likes the Great South Bay. And his wife buys him a little, what he called a putt-putt motorboat, which she names the Bob. And she gives him sandwiches, and every day he'd go out just exploring the Great South Bay. And I remember he said to me, and one day his attention starts to get focused on this sandbar, which is about 3 miles off Long Island. And he said he used to go over there day after day in this motorboat. He said the weeds were so thick that when he got out of the boat, he'd have to roll up he couldn't get close to the shore, he'd have to roll his pants up to his knees and pull the boat in through the reeds. But he says, when he got over there was nobody there. There was seldom even another human being there. But when he was there, he said, I'm standing on the whitest, most beautiful strip of sand that I've ever seen. And I suddenly realized, at that moment, I'm only 26 miles from Times Square. If I could find a way to get people out here, New York would have its bathing beach. And he said, and that was the moment, in an instant, that I thought of Jones Beach and the Southern State Parkway. So we're talking here, while I talked about one side of Robert Moses, the young side of Robert Moses, which I tried to portray in the book, is something wonderful.
Yes, the wonderful side of Robert Moses. There was one. He stood on a beach. I mean, we'll be criticizing Moses, obviously, but I think it's important to talk about these other things because he could stand on a beach and think it was a perfect spot for New Yorkers who wanted to escape because it wasn't far from Times Square, which is remarkable because no matter where I'm sitting, I can't help but think I'm not far enough from Times Square. But this was a central piece of Moses' brilliance, his vision. Moses imagined public works on a scale that few people dared to even consider, and not just at Jones Beach. Putt-putting around on his boat nearby at Fire Island, he discovered that tides had created 4 new miles of beach, sort of like God had gotten an extension or made an extension without obtaining the proper zoning permits. Oh, there's Jones Beach. Excuse me, there's Fire Island. You can see tides and how they might create more beach for someone like Moses to discover. Back on land, traipsing around through land that no one else was going to, Moses discovered abandoned Brooklyn Waterworks property. The property had belonged to the city of Brooklyn, and when Brooklyn became part of Manhattan or part of New York City in 1898, everybody had just sort of forgotten about it. But now Moses found it, and there were thousands of acres of it, thousands of acres of government-owned abandoned property. Moses realized he could turn that into beautiful parks. But again, the question remained, how would anybody be able to get there? He'd need to build new roads. And sure, a new road would have to cut through lots of people's property, but maybe that wasn't such a bad thing, because then the road would go through gorgeous estates. And if you're wondering, those estates had beautiful trees that Moses wanted people to see in their cars. If you're wondering, why would you look at trees so closely while driving? I just want to point out that maybe trees want to peep at you. And also, more to the point, I suppose, cars back then topped out at around 40 to 45 miles per hour. So driving on the highway was more like driving through It's a Small World. Granted, Moses doesn't seem to have considered that cars would speed up, making the journey more like traveling through It's a Small World on a jet ski, but that wasn't his problem. This is one of my magical photoshops. A friend asked for a cameo, and he got it. If you want a cameo, let me know. I take requests. So no, Moses' problem wasn't that we would have to deal with cars driving through on these highways at high speeds and those highways now not being able to sustain cars that are too heavy for them. No, his problem or his concern was figuring out a way to turn his audacious plans into reality. One day in 1924, when Al Smith asked, "What can I do for you?" I keep asking, "What can I do?" Moses finally said, "Parks. I'll write it out for you." And this gets to another piece of Moses' brilliance, which we already saw on display at Yale, his deviousness. Moses was a very devious and very clever person. In this case, he drafted two bills, which we'll get to here. One creating a Long Island State Park Commission, and the other enumerating the Long Island State Park Commission's rights to acquire property in some very interesting ways. In Chapter 122 of the Laws of 1924, Chapter 122, which might be more chapters than the Power Broker has, Moses said the Long Island State Park Commission had the right to acquire land by condemnation and appropriation in the manner provided by Section 59 of the Conservation Law. Section 59 of the Conservation Law. What was that? Well, in 1884, timber companies were clear-cutting the Adirondacks. In response, the state legislature passed a bill that basically allowed state officials to walk onto timber company property and declare it the property of the states. It was an emergency measure, meant only to be used in remote forests in the 1880s, but no one had repealed it. Instead, it had been forgotten, but not by Moses, the foremost expert on public administration in the whole country, and by then, as Carol calls him, or quotes someone else saying, the best bill drafter in Albany. Moses knew that he could use the precedent from the conservation law to basically give him and the Long Island State Park Commission the right to walk on people's property and say, "Mine. This is mine now." At this point, you might be wondering, did no one read the fine print? Were all of New York's lawmakers about to go on spring break? As it turns out, they were. Moses tricked an overeager state assemblyman into sponsoring his bills at the last minute of the spring session in 1924, and they passed unanimously without one word of debate. 8 days later, Al Smith signed the bills into law and appointed Moses as president of the Long Island State Park Commission. At the age of 35, Robert Moses had power. And no sooner did he have it than he showed how he was going to use it. Soon, he turned a mansion in Babylon, Long Island, home to the statue, into headquarters. From there, he ran a tight ship. He insisted his staff move up their, he insisted architects move up their deadlines by days, weeks, sometimes months. He made construction crews work around the clock. Wanting no distractions himself, he took few calls. Instead, if he wanted to summon a member of his staff, he would push a buzzer on his desk that would trigger a harsh buzzing sound in their offices. One engineer ate lunch virtually every day at his desk out of fear that Moses might buzz for him. Why work under those conditions? Well, the Moses men, and they were, of course, all white men, it can be known as the Moses men, knew that as hard as Moses worked them, he worked himself harder. It wasn't long before he was taking 0 days off. He would get to the office after everybody else and be there before everyone else. It was sort of that cliche, hyper-intense work atmosphere. Also, the Moses men were handsomely rewarded. If they weren't making enough on a government salary, in Moses' mind, he would do things like put their wives on the government payroll for answering the phones in their own homes, which sounds easy, but it might not be. And he would give them fully comped, secretly, fully comped taxpayer houses on public land. Many of those houses still stand today on Commissioners Road in Babylon, Long Island. We gotta go to Babylon, y'all. It's a lot of fun. But there was something else. I actually had a sort of uncomfortable experience. I'm remembering my trip to Babylon. It's okay. I can be rather long-winded in these sorts of stories. Let me try and keep it brief. There are no sidewalks at a certain point, which is like, there's a history of no sidewalks being in some places. That's like by design, of course, to limit pedestrians. and certain types of pedestrians, of course, the ones who can't afford cars. And I was walking down the street, and I increasingly felt more and more unwelcome. But I also had a foot injury at the time, and at a certain point, I was like, I need to take a break, and I just sat down on someone's lawn, and it was just an uncomfortable experience all around. Okay, that's me keeping it short. Okay. There was something else, though, that drew people to Robert Moses. His idealism, which still burned bright. As one of his engineers said, he made you feel that what we were doing was tremendously important for the public, for the welfare of people. And you know what? That's undeniably true to some extent. Consider all that Moses and his staff and his construction crews accomplished working nonstop. In April 1924, when Moses became president of the Long Island State Park Commission, there was one 200-acre state park on Long Island. Within 4 years, there were over 10,000 acres of public land on Long Island, and by 1933, there were well in excess of 15 state parks. Looking at just the western half of Long Island, I have a laser pointer. There's Sunken Meadow State Park, Belmont Lake State Park, Massapequa State Park, Meadowbrook State Park, Hempstead Lake State Park, Valley Stream State Park, Heckscher State Park, Fire Island State Park, Gilgo State Park. Only one state park I've mentioned so far was home to a serial killer that we know of. And Jones Beach State Park. Jones Beach was Moses' baby, and looking more closely at Jones Beach also reveals how Moses managed to get so much done, namely the backroom deals. Remember that few people on the South Shore wanted anyone from New York City in their space. They certainly didn't want Moses building the world's largest public beach nearby. So in 1925, he went to the area's power broker, a Republican official named G. Wilbur Doughty. Or Doty. I don't know. There's no record of what transpired at that meeting in 1925, but Caro pieced together a few things that happened afterward. First, construction contracts for Jones Beach were awarded to Doughty's brother-in-law. Second, a corporation with close ties to Doughty purchased undeveloped land that they soon sold back to the state at a premium for developing what would become the Jones Beach Causeway. Third, Doughty supported all of Moses' projects from that day forward, opening up the South Shore for him. Was all of that a coincidence? Was it a coincidence that Doughty grew rich off of Moses' projects? Was it a coincidence that Moses believed the ends justify the means? I would answer those questions, but my lawyers inform me that they're not my lawyers. They asked that I please stop emailing them. Okay, should I send a text? What do you think of Simon Lofton as the name of a law firm? Does that sound real? It's real. It's very real. Okay, just testing. So for the first and far from last time, Moses engaged in some light bribery. He was then free to turn Jones Beach into the park of his dreams. And let me tell you, his dreams were grandissimo. At the time, public beaches consisted of either small bathhouses for changing or boardwalks filled with carnival games. Moses, ever the artist, had something different in mind. Are you okay back there? Moses, ever the artist, had something different in mind. Commissioning the nation's the top landscape architects and engineers from around the country, he outlined how he wanted 2 bathhouses with 10,000 lockers apiece, made not of wood, as was standard at the time, but of the finest quality brick and stone. And surrounding them would be lawns, flower beds, hedges. His staff was surprised, you could say. As one of them said, nothing on a scale like this had ever been done in public recreation in America. Here we were on an absolutely deserted sandbar. There was no way even to get there but by boat. And here was this guy drawing X's on the back of an envelope and talking about bathhouses like palaces and parking lots that held 10,000 cars. We thought he was nuts. Notably, They thought he was nuts before he had workers dredge 40 million cubic yards of sand to make the land stable enough to support his planned bathhouses and parking lots. And before he put thousands of people to work planting seagrass by hand to keep the sand in place. And before he insisted the Jones Beach water tower be renovated to resemble the Venetian-style bell tower, or campanile. When lawmakers asked, how much is this going to cost us? Moses said, how can I put this in a way that you'll understand? Maybe a song will do? This is the sing-along. When the moon hits your eye like a big pizza pie, campanile. Great job. Shouts to all of you. You'll get another chance. Somehow, lawmakers were still unconvinced. When they asked, how much is this actually going to cost us? Moses said, I'm sorry? Did this song not work? Because I swear it sounds better the second time. This is the sing-along again. You know the words now. When the moon hits your eye like a big pizza pie, campanile. Somehow, lawmakers were still unconvinced. When they asked, how much is this actually going to cost us? Moses said, And they said, no more songs. Or the audience said, no more songs. We gave you $150,000 already, and we'll only give you $150,000 more. Which was not nearly enough for Moses to build any of the structures that he wanted to build, but more than enough to lay the foundation for them. This was a classic example of a strategy Moses called driving stakes. As he'd often say, once you sink that first stake, they'll never make you pull it up. And he was right. What could lawmakers do? Charge that he had misled them, thereby admitting that they hadn't investigated the project thoroughly enough in advance? Deny him further funds, thereby ensuring that the $150,000 already spent would be utterly wasted? There were political considerations too. As one reporter said, parks was a word like motherhood. It was just something nobody could be against. Other words I'd add to that list? Chocolate. Paddington 2. Excellent. Wayne's World 2. Fresh water streams with floating cigarettes. Catfish. How did you get a hold of the script? And the buzzer? That's the dumbest part of the show. The best and the worst part. So, afraid to be seen opposing parks and outwitted by Moses, lawmakers agreed to fund one of the bathhouses and the bell tower, the campanile, with Elspeth cobbling together the money for the second bathhouse. And you can see the results. There is the water tower, beautiful. The reflecting pool is no longer there, but it was gorgeous. Still is gorgeous. Here's one of the bathhouses, which you can see the brick and the stone that Moses insisted it be made of. And here's the view from the beach. As you can also see, people were thrilled. In its first month of operation after opening in 1929, over 315,000 people visited Jones Beach. Reporters from around the world, delegates from around the world, as well as the country, the city, the state, everywhere, came to admire what one English person called the finest seashore playground ever given the public anywhere in the world. Fast forward to today, and Jones Beach, if you ask me, is still extraordinary. I've visited a few times while producing this. I happen to really love Jones Beach now. I didn't expect that in this process. And say what you want about Robert Moses in front of all of you all for 80 minutes or so, but he believed in high quality public goods. Something I think we desperately need more of today. all these structures are still there, and they are really well made. At the same time, though he made high-quality public goods, he didn't like the public who was using them. One friend later said, "It used to shock me because he was doing all these things for the welfare of the people, and yet he denounced the common people terribly. To him, they were lousy, dirty people." So Moses may have elbowed politicians around and paid people off, seemingly for the benefit of the masses. But his goal wasn't the satisfaction of our dreams. It was the satisfaction of his. And if you've ever driven to and from Long Island, you might already be familiar with the consequences of that distinction. Let's go back to this map. I'm going to highlight a part of the Northern State Parkway. Let's zoom in on that. Lots of high-tech features here. Do you notice anything strange? Almost like Moses was drawing a straight line when planning this, but then somebody hit his elbow? What's up with this squiggle? Well, it goes back to Moses' power to walk on people's property and declare it mine. Recall that his original plan for the Northern State Parkway was set to run basically in a straight line through people's properties. Audaciously, he had crews show up one day to begin surveying people's property as they looked on, confused. Cue the calls to their lawyers, who for the first time read the fine print of Chapter 124 of the laws of Chapter 122 of the laws of 1924, and realized that Moses had given himself the power to take over the whole of Suffolk County, which encompasses 2/3 of Long Island, and that was understating things. Cue the calls to, I almost forgot my favorite part of the show. This, to analogize this, it's a little bit like you hired somebody to perform at a birthday party for you, only to realize that they had actually put a clause in the contract that said you had to blow up all the balloons for them, and then pick up all the metal chopsticks that you threw at the balloons. If this sounds like a real thing that occurred, it is.
Then I start throwing chopsticks. I'm doing well, and sometimes I miss it. I skipped a couple balloons just so I could have more balloons ready to go. And they overwhelmed me, and I popped all the balloons that I was going after. I had to go back diagonally across the board to get the balloons far away. And I popped them all. Come on.
Give it up for David Baker Rush. A hero. God, I love him. You can spend a lot of time looking at David Baker Rush videos. Now, unlike David Baker Rush, or at least the person that he conscripted into cleaning up all of those metal chopsticks, jealous. The millionaires on the North Shore had an effective recourse: money. They bribed Moses to build a parkway around their homes, or to at least put it to the edges of their property, which is what he did. Just as the Northern State Parkway was set to hit homes in the Wheatley Hills, part of the Gold Coast, Moses had it suddenly plunge south for 2 full miles. Driving on this plunge today is a curious experience. You're going straight, and then you begin to curve. You're sort of like, okay, this is new. I didn't expect this. It's certainly noticeable to the point that people were going to ask questions. So, to much public fanfare, and to keep his growing golden public reputation intact, Moses announced that the millionaires on the Gold Coast had paid the state for the detour, when in reality, it was funded mainly by taxpayers. And for the record, taxpayers still pay for it to this day, both in terms of upkeep and time. When Caro was writing The Power Brokers, published in 1973, there's the millionaires, he calculated that the cost of Moses' detour totaled tens of millions of wasted hours of human lives. Factor in the additional tens of millions of human lives spent on the detour since then, and that is almost way too much time spent listening to On Air with Ryan Seacrest. Even for me. Notice I said almost. And if that sounds unfair and unkind, let's return one last time to Jones Beach. Oh shit! Oh, I forgot this part. Thank you. This is very significant. Forgive me. I should say, when Moses moved the path of the highway, did it miraculously go through unclaimed land? No, of course not. He put it directly through the land of middle-class farmers, who would forever remember, to the end of their lives, the day in which they heard that the road was coming as a day of tragedy. Remember what Robert Caro said.
You know, he would destroy people who stood in his way.
And middle-class farmers certainly fit the billing. And if that sounds unfair and unkind, let's return one last time to Jones Beach. Here is my favorite power couple, Robert Caro and his wife, Ina. Ina helps Caro with his research. She's sort of the engine behind the books that keeps them going, and also kept their livelihoods afloat as Caro worked on his first book, The Power Broker. And they spent a lot of time at Jones Beach after, decades after Moses had built it, and they chronicled some troubling dynamics. The video I'm about to show you is about 2.5 minutes long, but I think it's worth showing in full.
The automobile age was just flowering. It was the 1920s, and he's creating Jones Beach. It's an act of great inspiration. But he doesn't want poor people, and in particular poor people of color, to use Jones Beach. So what he does, poor people in the 1920s and 30s don't have automobiles. So the only way they can get to Jones Beach is by mass transportation. So he takes care of the railroad side of that very easily. The Long Island Railroad wants to build a spur to Jones Beach. He just says no. But they can also get out there by bus. He doesn't want to take any chances of that. So the parkways out there, first he has legislation passed that buses can't use the parkways, which are the only way to Jones Beach. But then, as his chief aide once said to me, he said, you know, the commissioner, they called him the commissioner knew that legislation can always be changed. You can't change a bridge when it's up. So if you drive out to Jones Beach, you see along the Southern State and the Meadowbrook Parkways, the roads to Jones Beach. Clearance, there are 173 of these bridges. Clearance 13.9 inches, clearance 10 feet, because buses needed 14 feet of clearance, so people couldn't get there to buses. One of the revelatory moments of my life and Ina's life, I wanted to see how this affected over the decades. So now I'm doing The Power Broker. It's not 1930 anymore when he opened it. It's now, let's say, 1970, 40 years later. There's one big parking lot in Jones Beach with four underpasses that people use to get to the beach. We stood there, I had a pad, and I said whites, Latinos, blacks. And to this day, one of the moments that shaped my career as a biographer was the rage, really, that kept building in me as you said all these things for the white people, the number, hardly any for the Latinos, and even less for the blacks. You said, this is what public works, public policy does to the powerless, to poor people, and how long the effect of it lasts.
I think that clip gives you a sense of why Caro wrote The Power Broker. And for the record, Moses was right. Policy has changed since he built the bridges, but they are still there, and they are very low. The outcome, in total, of Moses' efforts to restrict access to Jones Beach is that it is still really hard to get there without a car. And in fact, impossible for 8 months of the year, which I learned the hard way when I tried to get a bus there in January, and the bus operators told me the next departure was in May. They did kindly allow me to pretend to get on the bus, which made for its own special experience. Now, unlike Moses' bribery, which again Caro discovered in carbon copies of records that Moses had forgotten to burn, people did notice Moses' discrimination. Black civic groups complained about their unfair treatment. A lot of other people complained when Moses instituted parking fees at all state parks on Long Island, which didn't exist anywhere else in the world to that point. FDR, who by that point had succeeded Al Smith as governor of New York, asked Moses to reconsider the parking fees, not the discrimination, the parking fees, but Moses refused and threatened to resign. And unlike Ed Richards, the swim team captain, pictured here, this time around, the person in charge, FDR, caved. He did not want Moses to resign. And for the record, he had good reason for Moses to resign. They hated each other. They had known each other through political circles for years, and both were very petty. On his side of things, Moses would make fun of FDR's disability and Eleanor Roosevelt's looks. To my knowledge, Moses never made fun of their dog Fala, which, come on. Go for the low-hanging fruit. A Scottish Terrier, a dog whose head is indistinguishable from its rear. It is a literal butthead. My point is that not even FDR, who was on his way to becoming one of the most powerful figures in American history, the only president to serve for 3 terms, until now. Sorry, too soon, too late. My point is, we can come back to that later. My point is, not even FDR would stand in Moses' way. Why? Well, here's one last quote read to you by Chris Dooley.
It is no good still to be laying cornerstones on election day. By then, a public official in executive office must have ribbons he can cut, monuments to which he can point with pride. This is a requirement established by democracy as it has evolved in America. Yet the realities of the democratic process in America make it almost impossible to get a road, a bridge, a housing project, a bathhouse, or a park approved and built in 2 years, or 4. The governor, who finds a man who can inject into the democracy public works equation a factor of personality so heavy as to unbalance it and get public works built during the span of a single term of office, has little choice, if he is ambitious for political success, but to heap on that man more and more responsibilities, even though the giving of responsibilities carries with it the grant of more power.
A factor of personality so heavy as to unbalance democracy. This is one of Caro's central arguments in The Power Broker, that Moses, through all of his multitudes, his brilliance, his artistry, his idealism, his elbowing people around, his bribery, his trickery, through all of his multitudes, Moses built parks and beaches for a public that adored him, even though he didn't like the public at all. Along the way, Moses accrued so much power that not even the bosses who hated him would stand in his way, until they had no choice but to give him more power, and finally democracy was tilted off its axis. Granted, we can quibble about how much democracy was on its axis. The black people, for example, still had a lot of trouble voting around the country, and their redlining was sort of the tip of the iceberg of structural racism in New York City and cities in the north. We can quibble about those things, but my point is that Moses made all of those things worse. Sometimes he used his power for good, for the masses. More often he used it to satisfy people with money. Always he used it to satisfy his own ego. The rest of us be damned. And once Moses accomplished his dreams on Long Island, he cast his gaze toward a city he didn't even want to live in, New York. Come out next time to learn more about that. One more sing along? We're out of time.